Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Postsecondary Pathways webinar. I'm James Michalowski, Director of Higher Education at the Hunt Institute, and we so appreciate you all joining us today for this exciting conversation. We are thrilled to be joined by Commissioner Carlos Santiago from the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education, Mamie Voight from the Institute for Higher Education Policy, and Chris Nellum from the Education Trust West. And we are going to focus today's conversation around higher education data and equity. We know that all policymakers want more information. They want to know specific areas of need within the landscape of their states, and they also want to know whether the existing initiatives are producing the desired outcomes for students. One example that we hear from policymakers relatively frequently is that they have policies on the books that support low-income students, but they want to know the extent to which those policies are supporting and narrowing equity gaps for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students. Without high-quality disaggregation, policymakers can better understand the impacts of current policies and areas of need for supporting different student populations. We also know today's topic has white peers. So it's crucially important to determine the scope of damage that the pandemic has inflicted on students of color and to use that information to guide policy decisions and resource allocation. So the great lineup of experts are going to unpack some of these issues a little bit more for us today. Before we jump in, a couple of really brief housekeeping notes from me. If you would like to follow along on social media with today's conversation, we ask that you use the hashtag #PostPathways. Please feel free to submit questions via Twitter as well. I'd also like to note that due to the large volume of participants, we are not going to be unmuting lines at any point today, but we do have time for a Q&A, and we ask that you submit your questions using the Q&A feature via Zoom at the bottom of your screen. One last note is that we are also live streaming on Facebook if you know of anyone who would prefer to tune in that way. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? And I'd love to turn things over to Commissioner Santiago to give us some brief opening remarks, talk a little bit about your work in the state, and in particular, how you and your team were able to prioritize equity in terms of the state policy goals.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon for some of you, and I guess good morning for others. But I'm delighted to join you, and thank you for the invitation from the Hunt Institute. It's always good to be here with colleagues, Chris and Ed Trust, who I know for we've worked together in the past, and Mamie, who I have met as well. So first, a little bit of information about the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education quickly. We are an organization, an agency that oversees higher education in Massachusetts, predominantly public higher education, 29 public institutions divided into 3 segments, our 15 community colleges, 9 state universities, and 5 UMass campuses. But our authority extends beyond the public institutions. We have oversight over the private institutions, which is somewhat surprising for a government organization. But we do oversee the privates in terms of closures and mergers and consolidations and program quality as well. So we work closely with the creditors too. Most of my comments today will be around equity and the equity agenda that we have launched in Massachusetts, which is an agenda that's embraced by all of our public institutions. So it's a system-wide imperative, and we'll talk a little bit later about how data got us to this point, because we've been even more specific. It is about racial equity in Massachusetts. The largest differentials that we see in student outcomes are by race and ethnicity. We're very clear about that. The data is very clear about that. And we look at all of our policies from a racial equity lens. So I'll stop with my introduction here and presumably get into more detail on how we got to where we are right now.
Thanks, Commissioner. We're very much looking forward to hearing some more detail about the story in Massachusetts.
Mamie, I'd love to turn to you next and ask you to give some brief opening remarks, talk a little bit about IHEP and your education policy work, and maybe a little bit about the importance of data for federal policy efforts to narrow equity gaps.
Absolutely. Thanks, James, and thank you, Commissioner Santiago, for getting us started in this great conversation. Like James said, my name is Mamie Voight. I'm the interim president at the Institute for Higher Education Policy, or IHEP. And at IHEP, we really envision a world in which all people, particularly those who've been underserved by our higher education system, so students from low-income backgrounds and students of color, have the opportunity to reach their full potential by participating in and succeeding in higher education. So with that vision in mind, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research policy and advocacy organization that's committed to promoting college access, success, and affordability, particularly for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. The research is very clear that higher education has a strong effect on building pathways towards economic and social mobility, but that pathway is not equitably available to all. And so all of the work that we do is centered around developing a more equitable post-secondary system. And with that framing and with that mission in mind is why we also at IHEP have a really strong focus on data and transparency. We recognize that evidence is necessary in order to identify equity gaps and then develop solutions towards closing them. So we lead an initiative called the Post-Secondary Data Collaborative, or POSEC Data, which brings together other organizations like EdTrust, for example, who are committed to using data to promote student success and enhance educational equity. And we do this at the institution level, the state level, and federal policy level. James, to your question about sort of where we stand in terms of federal policy to enhance data and transparency, we recognize that at the national level, we're data rich, but information poor. We have a lot of data, but it's not being translated into information that can inform decisions in the ways that we really need it to. Our data systems at the federal level are incomplete, they're duplicative, they're inefficient, and they're burdensome. And as a result, they can't answer the questions that students have, or that federal or state policymakers have, or that colleges and universities have about how to improve our post-secondary system and deliver opportunity more equitably. So we advocate for a solution at the federal level called a student level data network, or SLDN, which would create better transparency and information to give students the information that they deserve to be able to answer questions about where to go to college and what to study and how to pay for it. And it would also provide better information to state and federal policymakers and practitioners at the institution level to help them make evidence-based decisions using disaggregated data to enhance equity within our system. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation today with Commissioner Santiago and with Chris and colleagues. So I will pass it back to you, James, to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, Mamie. I have fond memories of participating in some of those post-sec data collaborative meetings back in my DQC days. Great to hear that the work continues, and looking forward to hearing more from you. Chris, we're going to throw things over to you now, and I would love for you to talk a little bit about Education Trust West, and in particular, for the work that you all do is really grounded in and informed by high-quality education data.
Sure, thank you, James, and it's good to be here. Thank you to the HUD Institute for the invitation, and of course, happy to be in good company with Mamie and Commissioner Santiago. As James said, my name's Chris Nellum. I'm with the Education Trust West. For those who are not familiar with us, we are the California-based office of the Education Trust. We have been in the state now, this is our 20th year actually, doing advocacy work and research work to close racial equity gaps in the state. Our mission is pretty clearly and laser focused on identifying and ultimately closing opportunity gaps, and we do that in a very race conscious way, and we make no apologies for our work that is focused on Brown and Black students in our state, and in particular low income Brown and Black students. On the issue of data, data is central to the work that we do. We've maintained for the last decade a campaign that we call Data for the People. It is our belief that the people who produce the data should have access to the data that they are providing to our institutions and to the state. And so we have made good use of data for at least 10 years, if not the full 20 years. And we do that at least 3 ways. Of course, we do it to illuminate disparities. It's important to use data to be clear about the disparities that exist in a race-conscious way. And so we do that pretty intentionally through reports and convenings, through opportunities like this one. We also for some time have built tools as proof points for the state, that because the state has been reluctant in some ways to build tools that people can actually engage with. So one example of a tool that we built that is now integrated into state into the state infrastructure is a financial aid tracker. Our state for a long time was not paying attention to the numbers of students who are completing the FAFSA, or in our case also the California DREAM Act. We created a tool through a data sharing agreement, which you shouldn't have to leverage to build this tool, but we did. Used it for many years, and now the state, the California Student Aid Commission, now has its Race to Submit dashboard. And so for us, building those tools as proof points is important. And then a third piece of our data work is, of course, bringing data to the people. And so we have, for a long time, done what we call data equity walks, where we engage with community-based organizations, families, parents, students themselves, and work with them to engage with data in some sort of experiential way so that they can understand the data and then think about ways to use the data in their own advocacy. So data is certainly pivotal to our work, but so is bringing those data to the people who can use it and benefit from it.
Thanks, Chris. That's such helpful context, and I love the data equity walk concept and the idea of putting this information in the hands of the people who could use it to advocate for students. Great. We are going to start our conversation. I have plenty of questions for our panelists. We have some pre-submitted questions as well, but we hope that you will be thinking of questions and that you will be entering them into that Q&A feature in the Zoom app. But I'm going to start with a question for Commissioner Santiago. Commissioner, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the fact that, in Massachusetts, you have successfully established specific attainment percentage goals for Black and Latinx students in the state, which is a real testament to how you centered equity in your work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the story of how you were able to establish those specific targets as priorities, and also talk a little bit about how that guides your work as you seek to support attainment for Black and Latinx students. Excuse me.
Sure, thank you. And I think important thing to remember, if you're from Massachusetts, you'll always hear the term education state. Massachusetts has the highest post-secondary degree conferral nationally. Very well known for that. Well known for a strong K through 12 system as well. We tout over 100 private institutions, some among the most exceptional institutions globally, and 29 public institutions. All that is great. We do call ourselves the education state, but I do have to credit is due to our friends at the Ed Trust and the Lumina Foundation and other organizations that said, don't celebrate too much Massachusetts, because your opportunity gaps, the differentials in a number of indicators look horrendous. And they were absolutely right. And we took a close look. I used the information they provided, and it confirmed that Massachusetts, on those grounds, in terms of equity, in terms of students of color, is not the education state. And we had meetings with leadership of some of these outside organizations and the governor's office, and our board decided in 2018 to move forward and make equity their primary priority. And we have done so. We have a data system that was built in collaboration over almost 2 years with our public institutions. So we all agree on the metrics. That's very important. We are now building an SLDS system, a longitudinal system, which we think is absolutely essential, goes from early childhood to higher ed and into the workforce. And we're working assiduously at that. But I think, when I started talking about equity in Massachusetts, I would use a data point that said white females were graduating at a 65% rate in our public institutions, and Latino males were graduating at a 22% rate. And I would talk a lot about that. But another part of that argument is that our data showed as early as 2014 that the demography was changing, that the numbers of students going from high school to college was declining dramatically. But masked behind that decline in students, in current and future students, was the fact that there was growth. There was growth among our communities of color, particularly the Latinx community was growing significantly. That proved a real economic problem for a state that relies so much on educated labor to get its knowledge-based economy moving forward. So I made the case in a paper that this was about social justice, that we were leaving way too many students behind. And this was also an economic imperative for the state, that if we were to continue to increase our standard of living in Massachusetts, we would have to tend to these unequal outcomes that we were getting. And data was behind all of that. And there was a vigorous discussion about what are we talking about when we're talking about these opportunity gaps? Is it about race? Is it about ethnicity? Is it about income level? And you could say it's about all of the above, but our data showed pretty clearly that the biggest gaps were around race and ethnicity. So we have now continued to look at it from a data perspective as we deal with policy, but we've had to change the organization. If you're really going to talk about racial equity, you have to be trained to talk about racial equity. And our organization, for every person has gotten training. We are now in the midst of a policy audit of all our policies, from admissions to college to graduation, looking at them very, very carefully. And we have a bunch of task forces out there working on reimagining undergraduate education. It has to be different. We have been pushing the point that we have to quit looking at asking the question whether students are ready for college. College-ready students used to be the mantra. Now that we've turned that question around and basically said, are our institutions ready for the challenges that we're going to face in the future in getting these students into and successfully through our institutions? So it is reimagining, in some respects, it is reimagining higher education. We cannot use the previous models. We've known, they've been around for years. I'd like to say over 100 years. And they're not serving the students that need to be served today. So it is, from my perspective, it is a revolution in how we see higher education, how we see its role, and how we see who it serves. And we appreciate that data has aligned with what we're trying to do. And we've used the data as we make our policy platforms move forward. So it's a big lift. But I'm proud to say that the public institutions in Massachusetts have basically said, we're behind this. This is our future too. And we're pleased that organizations like the Lumina Foundation have decided to designate Massachusetts as a TIE state, talent, innovation, and equity state, and have provided some funding to keep this moving forward.
What an exciting paradigm shift, and so great to hear that there's been buy-in from public IHGs and other stakeholders. And Commissioner, I love how you framed, the question is both a moral and economic imperative of the need to focus on some of these student populations. Mamie, I'd love to turn to you next. We've heard Commissioner Santiago and Chris talk a little bit about their work in states. And you talked a little bit about kind of the maze of data systems at the federal level. If there were a better, more robust, more complete federal student data system, how would that help people like Commissioner Santiago and Chris who are working in states to close equity gaps?
Yep, absolutely. And so many states are doing the hard work of harnessing the data that they have at their disposal to make evidence-based decisions and to design state policies and target resources towards the students who most need the support. We've heard Commissioner Santiago talk about those efforts of building a state longitudinal data system in Massachusetts, and Chris talking about how they in the nonprofit sector have stepped in to support some of the tool development that the state needs in California. And many states are relying on their state longitudinal data systems, which are incredibly powerful and are not going anywhere, and we absolutely need to continue supporting. Those systems at the same time do have some limitations, especially when looking at linking post-secondary data to workforce data. Many states are doing this and putting out better information for students to understand the value of their credential and help them make informed decisions. But those state systems also are missing many students. They're missing students who leave the state for employment. They're missing students who go to work for the federal government or are members of the military, students who are self-employed after leaving college. And in many states, we're missing private institutions in the state longitudinal data system, private nonprofit and for-profit institutions. And so these systems in many cases are not counting the outcomes of all students. And if we're to have a fully robust picture of what our systems look like to inform student decision-making, to inform policy-making, and to inform practice change, particularly for Black, Latinx, Indigenous students and students from low-income backgrounds, we simply have to count all students and we have to count all outcomes. And state data systems right now are not equipped to do that. The federal solution could provide states with much of this information on the students for whom they are missing data. So a student level data network at the federal level, there's actually a bill in Congress right now called the College Transparency Act. It's a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that would fill in a lot of these gaps at the federal level with data that already exists, that are held either by the federal government or by institutions. It would link data together more effectively and then be able to provide aggregate reports back to states on information about student mobility and workforce outcomes within the state and across other states. All of that information being disaggregated by race and ethnicity, by economic background, by gender, by key student characteristics that allow decision makers to make truly informed decisions, and importantly, to provide students with the information that they deserve in order to make more informed choices. And so we really see the state longitudinal data systems working hand in hand with a federal solution so that states can get into the level of detail that they need to for their unique state needs, while also leveraging the power of data that already exists at the federal level and providing that information back to states and back to institutions to help them inform their own decisions and policymaking.
Thanks, Mamie. That's very helpful context and goes back to what Chris was talking about in terms of putting data in the hands of those who can use it most effectively. So love how you talked about those feedback loops. Chris, I'm going to turn to you and ask you a question now. Kind of similar to Mamie, I'm going to ask you to imagine a world in which a wonderful state longitudinal data system fully formed exists in California. I know this has been a big priority for Education Trust West for over a decade, and I know that Governor Newsom's budget proposal from last month included a significant investment in creating an SLDS. So I'd love for you to talk about how, if such a system were in place, how would that allow you to better advocate for Black and Latinx students in California?
Yeah, thanks for the question. You know, I think there are at least 4 ways that having a more robust data system would help our advocacy in the state. I think a first one of those is we have a pretty healthy ecosystem in the state of community-based organizations, parent and student-led organizations who consistently tell stories about the ways in which higher education is working for them or not. And I think those stories are extremely powerful. They're helpful to help, support our advocacy, but having a data system with connected data, I think would help us with that information sharing. What we often hear from advocates is we're told by policymakers our stories aren't enough. I would argue that they're really important because that's the way that real people are experiencing education, but they're often told their stories aren't enough. So us being able to facilitate data sharing with them is really important. to support their advocacy. So that's one way a data system would support the work that we do, and really, really important to us as an organization to improve our ability to do that. You know, the other, as you mentioned, Governor Newsom put about $18 or $19 million in this year's budget to help with phase one of our data system. And, you know, one of the things that we're looking forward to is being able, our state invests upwards, maybe over $120 billion annually in education, with a B, billion dollars. And we can't understand basic questions in our state. How much does it cost to educate a young person at each of our public systems? We have 3 public higher ed systems. We have the private nonprofit system, the for-profit system as well. We can't answer how much, we can estimate, but we can't really answer how much the cost of education differs across those segments. We also can't answer, you know, how many young people earn a bachelor's degree in some period of time, assuming that they probably went to a couple of different institutions in our state. So being able to understand our investment, our $120 billion investment a year, about really simple questions, I think will be another thing that will be extremely important to us. And I think connected to that is understanding effectiveness. Our state has done some pretty, I would argue, you know, innovative things, creative things over the years. We have, you know, a cadre of innovative, committed policymakers on issues of higher ed, but we really, not with any ease, can understand the impact of any of those proposals. And if we can, it's not as easy as it should be. So those are just some ways that we're excited about the data system progress that we're making, contributing to our advocacy in the state.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Very helpful context, and such important activities for you to be able to, you know, understand as an advocate. So we appreciate the background there. We are going to transition into some Q&A now from the audience. As a reminder, please submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom chat, or you can submit them on Twitter as well using the hashtag #postpathways. But we have a great question here from Andy McCracken, who's from the NC Pandemic Recovery Office. And I'm going to ask all 3 of you to respond to this question. Andy notes that a lot of K-12 and post-secondary data reports come in 12-month intervals. And he's wondering what data you are prioritizing in the interim to map out the impact of the pandemic and strategies that advance equity-focused work. So Commissioner Santiago, I'll go to you first. What sort of data are you looking at in the interim to understand the impact of the pandemic?
Well, obviously it's difficult in this environment to say we're going to come up with new data. There's a lot that we need to know. I think one of the things the pandemic has shown us is the insufficiency of our data systems, even the public data systems. But you know, there are leading indicators. We started to see in March of last year, we started to see a dramatic decline in FAFSA completion prior to the previous year, compared to the previous year. And the declines were pretty stark. We had a deadline for FAFSA completion a few months later, and I pushed it out to July because the data was so troubling. And it turned out to be true. The numbers of students that were completing FAFSA was just dropping dramatically. We looked a little more closely at that data. We looked at the racial and ethnic composition of the data, and we found that it was largely students of color that were not completing the FAFSA. And it's come to the point where our most recent sort of data review has shown that in the community colleges where 2/3 of our students of color reside, there was a decline in enrollment in the fall term, in the last fall, of 1/3. It's a huge decline. And we have been working with K-12 to understand that these are new students. These are first-time students. But we need to further understand the why, and whether, you know, the big conversation I had with my counterpart in K-12 was, is this a 1-year impact? Is it a 2 or a 4-year impact? We still don't quite know. But clearly the pandemic brought some severe disjunction to the lives of these students. And in particular, many of them were part-time students. They lost their jobs. COVID was running rampant in communities of color, and they were not about to bring it back to their homes. And this has taken a toll, and we have seen it. I think later I'll talk a little bit about sort of the fact that we have now discovered that basic needs has to be a huge priority. You thought college wasn't about basic needs? Well, I'll tell you, college today is about basic needs for the students that we're trying to get through. So data has been especially important in our trying to understand. I'm not saying our data systems are perfect. They're far from perfect. I know there was a question about qualitative data. Quantitative and qualitative data, hugely important if you're going to be involved in college work. And we're going to need to have multiple indicators, because we know, you focus on a success rate, you're talking about a 4 to 6 year graduation rate. That's just too long a time frame. If that's what you're betting on in terms of finding out whether programs work, you're going to be way late to the game. So we try to do everything we can, data supported, but quite honestly, there is a lot that we just don't know. Mamie mentioned about the lack of information on private institutions. That's absolutely correct. Here we have an attainment goal for Massachusetts that is not just its public institutions. And we have little sense of how the private institutions might be contributing to that overall goal.
Thanks, Commissioner. Very helpful, and echoes what Chris was saying about kind of the importance of qualitative data paired with quantitative data to tell impactful stories. Mamie, I wonder if you have any reaction to this question about interim measures of the pandemic's impact.
Yes, I think Commissioner Santiago hit the nail on the head here in talking about things like FAFSA completion data, which are early indicators of what the enrollment trends are likely to look like, and then those are early indicators of what ultimately we are going to see for several years in terms of the attainment trends and what types of gaps likely are to have grown when we look at who attains a bachelor's degree or an associate's degree several years down the line as a result of the pandemic that we're seeing now. Black, Latinx, Indigenous students and students from low-income backgrounds are being hit harder by the health impacts of the pandemic, by the economic impacts of the pandemic, and all of those really just pile on each other to make post-secondary education an even greater challenge during these times. And so we're going to see those gaps, I think, emerge over the coming years. There are some indicators that that we use in higher ed, even in normal times, that could be useful here as well to try to better understand and unpack what's happening in a more real-time basis rather than waiting those 4 or 6 years. Often institutions will look at indicators like the percentage of students completing gateway courses within the first year of being enrolled, the percentage of students earning 15 credits in their first semester or 30 credits in their first year as indicators of whether students are on track towards completion or not. And so institutions and states can be looking at how those trends are looking now compared with how they looked before the pandemic, and then always within there disaggregating the data by race, ethnicity, by income status, by gender, to understand what types of inequities are appearing already so that the institutions and so that state policymakers can intervene to try to get students back on track before we do see those big gaps that could be coming down the road several years from now. One other piece of information that we've been encouraging collection at the federal level on, we don't yet have it, but looking at more regular information on students passing in and out of distance ed status to hybrid status to brick and mortar status. We don't fully understand the impacts of distance learning, especially in this current environment on student persistence and student success. And we need to have better information since things are changing on the ground just on a day-to-day basis for students in terms of how they're engaging with their learning. We need a better understanding from a policymaker perspective of what those impacts are from students bouncing back and forth between different delivery models. So we're hoping to see better information come by way of that as well.
Thanks so much, Mamie. You also kind of anticipated another question we had from Jaime Ramirez Mendoza from Entrust, who asked about what data points are not currently being collected that could help us understand some of these equity gaps. So thank you for anticipating Jaime's question. And Chris, I'll turn over to you to talk a little bit about interim measures in California, and also feel free to throw out your ideal data collection point that you would use to understand equity gaps?
Sure. I think Mamie and Commissioner Santiago hit on most of, I think, what had come to mind for me. I think one thing I would add is in California, we have a college preparatory sequence called the A through G sequence. And we have a tool that is called Ccgi. And the important piece about that is if we had, so there are hopes with the new data system to incorporate Ccgi into the statewide data system. Counselors use this tool to share with students whether or not they're on track in real time to be eligible for our four-year public colleges and universities. I think given, and the challenge with Ccgi is only some institutions participate right now through, again, a complicated complicated maze of MOUs and agreements. And I think if we had the statewide data system now, had a mechanism so that counselors could report that data up, which is the hope, I think we would have some more real-time information about what is happening. I know we've heard anecdotally that for our new potential first-year college students, the pandemic has had enormous impacts on their ability to stay enrolled in these A through G or college prep courses, but we don't really know the extent to which that's actually happening, where it's happening. And I think if we did, which is the hope, again, with our data system, we could probably deploy some more targeted, meaningful interventions to help. And so that's one data point that I know that we would like to have had more access to, certainly because right now it's only happening in pockets of the state. And as you know, California is a big state, and doing things in pockets of the state is not going to contribute to systemic change in any way.
Thanks, Chris. Very helpful context. Moving on, we've got a great question from an anonymous attendee that I'd love to move to. And we've been blessed with a large number of questions. I do apologize if we're not able to address yours during the webinar, but this person asked about a thing that's top of mind for many people right now, which is the amount of people who are seeking to or upskill and access workforce training opportunities, especially displaced workers who may have been affected by the pandemic. But this person brings up the point that there's a concern about tracking students of color or low-income students into these shorter-term credentialing programs and preventing them from pursuing a four-year bachelor's degree, which we know carries a greater earnings premium in the workforce. How can data help us think about this issue of making sure that short-term credential policies are serving students well and that we're not creating bad incentives? Commissioner Santiago, I'll turn to you first to see if you have any comment on this question.
Sure, and it is a legitimate concern. I think all of us sometimes have questions about programs that appear to be tracking like programs. Of these students will take these programs and these other students will take those programs. And you have to be a bit suspicious about that and dig deep. And we've revamped all of our transfer pathways. I mean, there was a time just 5 years ago when you could take a course at one of our public institutions and not transfer it anywhere to another public institution. It made no sense whatsoever. It was just a hodgepodge of institutional one-on-one relationships. And we've created a system that students can take a course anywhere, including up to 41 different majors at one 2-year institution and transfer to a 4-year institution. That's a lot of work to do, but what we've always tried to do is to ensure that if students get on a particular path, that they can have options to move into other paths over time. And we do everything possible so that these pathways are not terminal, so that they don't come to an endpoint. There are always options, and there are financial incentives that we introduce for students to go one step further. We know that, for some students, and for many students, going to college is a pathway for a job, a new and better experience. But we have to look at it into a longer term basis. It's not just going from college to a job. It is a lifetime of training that's going to be required. If you think what you're doing now is not going to be obsolete in a bit, just wait. things are changing, and I think what higher education does is it provides students, and we're all students in this, pathways so that their training can adjust to whatever new reality is before them. And that's what we try to do. We're not perfect, but I think if you think about the long term in these pathways, I think overall the students will benefit.
Thanks, Commissioner. I love the framing of keeping a long-term perspective, even when talking about some of the shorter-term career training programs. Mamie, anything to add on this question?
Sure. I think especially as we think about the role of data in unearthing inequities that could exist through tracking pathways, as the person who asked the question raised, data is the perfect way to understand those inequities that exist. So disaggregate the data on who is enrolled in which types of programs and what are the ultimate outcomes of those programs. Are they delivering the same type of value to students in terms of their economic returns, the short-term credentials, the AA, the BA, and who is in which of those programs? And then have an honest reckoning with what does that mean that this program is overrepresents white students and this program is overrepresenting African-American students, for example. And then as Commissioner Santiago was speaking about a few minutes ago, talking about doing an equity audit. Well, what's led to that happening? What policies are leading to this deep stratification that we see in our data? The data themselves are not going to change things, but people using data and using it to ask those difficult questions and then follow up on those questions and make changes based on the results in the data, that's where the change happens. And I think this question of tracking is a perfect example of a way that data can shed light on a situation that leads to changes across the system.
Thanks so much, Mamie. Chris, anything to add on this?
I don't. That was great.
Wonderful. We will move on then. We've got a couple of questions asking about particular student populations that we haven't mentioned too explicitly yet, and I'd love to invite you all to weigh in. One attendee, Marcos Rivera from Ohio State University, asked about transfer students and how we can capture the movement of transfer students in some of our data systems. And then another attendee asked about the justice impacted community and how we can better use data to advocate for expanding high quality higher education opportunities in correctional facilities. I would invite anyone who would like to jump in to speak. Chris, I feel like you going last in the other questions has disadvantaged you, so I'll invite you to respond to this one first.
Sure, I'm happy to get us started. One of the, it's a good question. And one of the things that, as I mentioned before, in California, we, if a student attends multiple institutions in our state, which we know with 115 and potentially counting community colleges in the state, some in urban areas where you can hop around based on, class availability, we know that our current data systems do not give us the option to track what happens to that person, to that student. So one thing that we need in our state is a common identifier to help understand, student behavior and student course taking patterns, which we know are not as perhaps linear as one might want them to be, or maybe they were in the past. And so that is certainly one thing that I think we need to get better at in our state, is ensuring that, from early ed on, that folks have an identifier that we can use to understand their movement through systems. And I think that includes our justice impacted folks who, hopefully will one day, and we know the data suggests this, will leave that system and return maybe to some more quote unquote traditional higher ed settings. And if we have an identifier for them, we can do that work more effectively. So that's one thing that we certainly need to do in our state.
Thanks, Chris. Very helpful. Commissioner Santiago, anything to add on this question?
No, I don't have anything much more to add to that.
Perfectly fine. Wanted to give you the opportunity. Maybe I'll urge you to say.
Not at a loss for words, but I think I am now.
No realm at all. Mamie, is there anything you'd like to chime in with?
I'll add just a quick point on the issue of reinstating Pell Grants for students who are incarcerated. That's something that I have as long advocated for. We partnered a lot with the Education Trust in those advocacy efforts, and so are thrilled to see that ban overturned. We also have developed and released a key performance indicators framework for measuring measuring how higher ed and prison programs are performing. And we want to ensure that as Pell Grant access is opened up and as individuals who are incarcerated get access to post-secondary education, which can be so transformative for individuals inside and outside of prison, we want to make sure that the quality of the educational programming is high. And so this key performance indicators framework, which you can find on our website, describes a number of different measures that can be used to ensure that those programs are of high quality. And so we anticipate continued discussions about how to work with prison programs to deliver that high quality education.
Thanks, Mamie. A couple of attendees have asked similar questions that I'm going to combine. They're wondering about how K-12 districts and higher ed leaders can collaborate going back to this idea of putting data in the hands of those who can leverage it and use it to advocate for students. And both of these attendees particularly asked about high school counselors, who are often stretched pretty thin in terms of the student caseloads that they're dealing with. So how do we think about capacity building for the people who might use these data systems that are being put in place, particularly for someone like a high school counselor who may not have time in their day to carve out to, analyze or pull data? Commissioner Santiago, you talked a little bit about capacity building, so I'll let you respond to this one.
Sure. Well, I think it's very clear that higher ed and K through 12 have to work very closely on this. We just don't have the information. If we wait till they get to higher ed and get the information from them, at that point it's way too late. So we actually, with the FAFSA completion, we've been working very closely with K through 12. We've identified 50 different high schools where the majority of students of color are coming from. And begun to survey the students and talk to the counselors and get some explanation, and not only finding out why a student did not complete a FAFSA and did not go on to college, but how about the ones that did complete a FAFSA and did go to college? And I think this brings us to an important consideration that we're looking at, which is affordability. I often say affordability is a necessary condition for student success, but it's not sufficient. And what we're seeing, particularly for students of color, I'm an economist and I look at success of a student in college as an issue of information. How much information does a student get to succeed in college? It's not only classroom information, it's information you get from your family, from your communities, from other students, from your peers. And the quality of that information. And it's pretty clear that if there's not a member of your family, immediate family, that has gone to college, it's much more difficult to get that information. So we really are putting a lot of actually financial support into what we call the case management system, which is basically counselors that are going to assist these students and really help them get through some of the struggles. I was going to mention that the basic needs approach. All of our data now suggests that homelessness, hunger, transportation, childcare, these are not what we would call necessarily the costs of instruction, but these are the costs of attending an institution. And these students that we see today, particularly students of color, are really burdened by a lot of these costs. I'll add mental health to that list. And we're looking at all of these particular issues. We have a statewide task force that's going to come up. We're doing a strategic plan. But the reality is that you have to do something about this. You can't simply assume that students are going to study when they're going hungry and have no place to live. So we've done things like our state universities opened their residence halls spaces to community college students. Every public institution has a food pantry. We're exploring different options for mental health provision to students as well. This is the reality of going to college today for many of these students. And we have to provide the support structure. I'm glad that, you know, a guidance counselor said we need the information, because they are a crucial component of a success for a successful student. And sometimes we think it's just about giving the students more money. Well, that's a part of it, but there are other real important things that we can do to help these students get through the difficulties they face.
Thanks, Commissioner. And often by kind of equipping and empowering people who work with students every day, that can make it easier to uncover some of these areas of additional need that policymakers should be thinking about. Mamie, would invite you to chime in on this question about capacity building for people who might use education data.
Yeah, you know, I think Commissioner Santiago covered this one, so happy to pass it along to Chris.
Sounds great. Chris, anything to add, or should we move on to our closing remarks?
I think I'll only add two things. You know, if folks are looking for maybe examples of where this is happening. So certainly in California's Central Valley, we have the Central Valley Higher Education Consortium. They, I think, are a really good example of bringing K-12 educators, higher ed educators, and community-based organizations together to think about a regional collaborative around sharing data and tools and capacity building. So I think they're a good place to look. Again, I also mentioned earlier I always blank on this acronym, but the California College Guidance Initiative, CCGI, is a tool that, you know, I think recognizes that we underinvest in counselors in our state. So we probably should do better. We need to do better at lowering the counselor to student ratio in K through 12. But this tool, CCGI, is meant to be something that counselors can use in a really seamless and hopefully effective way to do, you know, better college counseling. And so I think, again, that only exists in some of the high schools in our state. So we need to scale that and make sure that folks have the resources they need to be able to use it to support students.
Thanks, Chris. Always helpful to have some examples to lift up. We're coming up on time, and we do apologize for all the great questions that we weren't able to get to, but I'd like to invite each of our experts to give a couple of minutes of brief closing remarks. I wonder if you all can look into the future as we've done throughout this conversation and think a little bit about what do you see as the most promising ways of using data going forward to help narrow equity gaps, whether it's in relation to the specific pandemic response or kind of a longer term view of how we might best use data to advocate for students going forward. So Commissioner Santiago, you already touched on this a little bit with your discussion of basic needs, but I'd invite you to unpack that further or add anything else that you'd like to add.
Yeah, and I want to go back to something Mamie had mentioned, and I think came up in one of the questions in the that was presented from a member of the audience. They talked about data rich and information poor, and that really is, you know, kind of the world we generally live in, world of incomplete information. We're always trying to improve the information set that we look at, and how we use that information is crucial. You know, let me give you an example. When we evaluate the presidents in our public institutions in Massachusetts, we use data to evaluate them, and they're, you know, readily you know, willing to do that. But try using data and outcomes on racial equity in a presidential evaluation, and it goes to the board, and people start talking about it, and throughout the organizations, the institutions, people understand that that this is something they need to look at. You can't ignore it when it's on a presidential evaluation. And I think we need, that's, from my perspective, that's taking it seriously. If you are trying to move an initiative forward and it's not something that a president of an institution can respond to, you're not really moving the needle very much. So it's the presidents and boards that have to be fully feel comfortable with the use of data and feel that it's providing the information they need to make informed decisions. So I think I love that expression, we're data rich and information poor, but I think it's how you use that information as well that can make a real difference for policy purposes.
Thanks, Commissioner. That's so important. And really another form of capacity building, making sure that institution presidents are comfortable using data and leveraging it to guide their actions. Mamie, would love a couple of minutes of closing remarks from you talking about what you're excited about in terms of the future of using data to advance equity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love that example of using data in presidential evaluations, because I think it gets at what's so core to a lot of this work, and it's about building a data-driven culture. It's building a culture in which people ask for data to inform their decisions, and data are used on a regular basis, not to make a decision, but to open up the conversations and keep the focus on the items that the organization, the institution, or the state has determined are important. And with racial equity being at the core of those measures, then that forces the conversation to continue coming back to what you've set as the important indicator. And so I think building that campus culture, building that state culture of data-driven decision-making is key. So that's one thing that I'm eager to see continue develop across the country. And then the other thing is, and this gets to one of the questions in the chat about the status of the College Transparency Act, CTA was introduced in last Congress and was deeply bipartisan, had immense support across the board in both the House and the Senate. In fact, it had over half of Congress co-sponsoring this bill. And that's a huge endeavor in this current climate of deeply divided politics. This is something that politicians understand and believe in, to use data to inform decision making. And so we anticipate that it will be reintroduced this Congress, and are very hopeful that it will be able to move with continued strong support from Democrats and from Republicans in both the House and the Senate. And so that's something that I'm eager to continue working on over the course of this year, and hopeful to see some real movement on.
Thanks so much, Mamie. Chris, would turn things over to you to hear what you're excited about in terms of the future of data equity work in California.
Yeah, and I know we're short on time, so I'll keep it short for you. One of the things that I'm excited about is that we have turned a corner in California. We have folks who are asking questions that, for us, point to a desire to be more data informed. That's exciting. We also are seeing that folks, I think, if there's any sort of bright spot in all of this COVID and pandemic experience that we've all had in California, is I think folks are realizing now, I think as Commissioner Santiago mentioned earlier, that there are questions that we should be able to answer right now in the midst of this crisis that we can't. And so folks, I think, are really committed to and excited about investing in data now, so that when the next situation comes, and we know in California we have fires every year, there's probably another pandemic, probably in our lifetime on the way. We know that there are other interruptions that we will experience, and we need the data now. We need to invest in data now so we can be better prepared the next time.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great silver lining to end on. We so appreciate you all joining us today. Thanks again so much to our wonderful panel of experts. I have one brief housekeeping note as we depart today, and that is to tell you about some upcoming webinars that we are hosting here at the Hunt Institute. The first one is coming up on Thursday. It's the latest in our Race and Education series. Then a week from today, on Tuesday, February 23rd, we have a webinar in our Early Efforts series focused on early childhood education. And then Thursday, the 25th, jointly with our friends at the Data Quality Campaign, we have a webinar focusing on policymaker insights on skip year growth. So we hope that you will join us for some of those conversations as well. Thanks again so much for your presence and your engagement. We hope to see you again on the Hunt Institute webinar soon.